Hello, this is Ben Moore, Finance Manager for the Office of Community Assistance. In this video, we'll walk through the budgeting for personnel and fringe line items on the GATA budget template. The budget line items included in this video are 101 and 102 for the program support category, and 301 and 302 for the administration category. The personnel and fringe lines are grouped together to include both program support and direct administration lines. Pay special attention to what items specifically belong in administration, or apply those portions of costs that pertain to administrative staff to the direct admin lines. The items that must be charged to administration for these budget line items. The wages and fringes for staff salaries such as the executive director, fiscal officer, bookkeepers, and other agency-level administrative staff must be charged to budget lines 301 and 302 accordingly, and they may not be charged to the program support line items 101 and 102. As far as the minimum requirements for the cost grid detail, you need to list the name and position of each employee budgeted to the grant, including vacant positions, and for that you would just list vacant in the name column. You need to enter the full annual salary times 12 months, or if it's an hourly salary and hourly employee, you need to list the hourly wage times the number of annual hours multiplied by the percentage of time spent working in that grant's program. And the total percentage of time for each person cannot exceed 100% across all grant budgets they are budgeted on, including the percentages listed on both the program support and direct administrative personnel tabs. So essentially an employee, the time that they are budgeted in across all grants, including the admin and the program support portion that they are charged, if you add that up, they cannot exceed 100%. Here's an example of the personnel tab. Here's how you would enter an employee who has an annual salary. You put their annual salary there. The basis would be years. Then here you would add the percentage of time that they spend in this particular grant you're budgeting, and then the length of time. And this final column will automatically calculate out based on the information you put about that particular employee. And here are examples of if it's a monthly employee, if you're budgeting that person by their monthly salary, and here would be the hourly wage times the number of hours they're working. And in each case, you would, in this percentage of time, you would enter the percentage of time that that employee spends working on the grant you're budgeting. The minimum requirements for the narrative section of this budget, you need to give a brief description showing how each position's job duties pertain to the grant. If an employee is listed on both program support and administration, or on more than one grant, please tell how their salary is divided or allocated among each of the OCA grants within the program being budgeted. So if you're budgeting for weatherization, you would list how that person is spread across all three weatherization grants that OCA provides. You would list the grants and the percentages applied to each. The total must not exceed 100%. Additionally, state how the percent applied is determined. For example, the allocation across each grant is determined by timesheets. And a special alert on this, please be aware that the allocation of costs across multiple grants within the same program, they need to be based on some measurable criteria, such as a percentage of customers served for that grant, but in no case may it be based on the grant funding level. So you can't allocate one particular grant more of the cost simply because you have more funding for that. So please be aware of this during all the allocations in your OCA budgets. The items to include in personnel, obviously you include all the personnel costs for the grant that you're budgeting, but one particular item to take note of is that you do not include contractual staff on the personnel and fringe tabs. If they're not an agency employee, if you're contracting for their services, then the staff hired through a temp agency or other contractually hired staff must be budgeted in the contractual line item, which is 106 for program support and 306 for admin. So please pay attention to that as you're preparing this portion of the budget. So for the fringe line, which are lines 102 and 302, 102 is program support, 302 is admin, the items that must be charged to administration for fringe are the fringes, including but not limited to health insurance, life insurance, workers' comp, retirement, and Social Security for the executive director, for the bookkeeper or bookkeepers or finance staff or any other agency level administrative staff. The minimum requirements for the cost grid, you can use one of two methods when you show the fringe cost. The first method is if you're using a set fringe rate for figuring fringe benefits, use the grants portion of their total annual salary, which is the last column of the personnel tab, and then you apply the fringe rate to get that grants portion of the fringe benefits. The second option is if you are using the percentage of time devoted to the project or program, you use that employee's total annual fringe amount across all programs and apply the percentage of time they spend to this grant. Needs to be the same percentage of time from the personnel tab to get the grants portion of their annual fringe. And in this, one basic difference between these two is that in the first method, you were just taking their salary and applying a set fringe rate to that. In the second methodology, you are calculating the fringe cost separately from this budget spreadsheet and then applying the percentage of time they're spending in this grant to the fringe amount that you've calculated externally. So either method you use should result in the same fringe amount. This slide gives examples of how you would utilize each method that I described in the previous slide. So in the first example for method 1, this employee, their calculated personnel cost on the personnel tab is $25,000. On the fringe tab, you would carry that $25,000 over and make it the base for that employee. You would then use the fringe rate that you apply to that base to come up with their fringe benefit cost. In the second example, you would have calculated the actual fringe benefit cost separately, which in this case for employee number 1 is the $21,181.19, and you would then apply the same percentage of time that employee spends in the program to that fringe amount to get the proportion that is applied to this grant. So in this case, employee number 1 spends 20% of their time on this grant. So on the fringe tab, you would take 20% of the calculated fringe amount, and that is the cost that you would apply, a fringe rate cost that you would apply to this grant. And as far as the minimum requirements for the narrative section, for this particular budget category, you need to list what items are included in the fringe. You need to include the percentages for items calculated based on the percentage of salary and the dollar amounts for items that are based on flat rates. You need to explain the reason if the fringe rates, if you're using the first method, or annual fringe base, the second method, differ between employees. So if you have large swings in percentages between different employees, you need to explain why those differences exist. This slide provides some examples of what the narrative section may look like for the fringe benefit budget, depending on which method of calculation you use. In the top section here, there's an example of the first method of calculation, and as you'll see, the narrative has two sections. One outlines the fringe benefits for a part-time employee. This bottom section outlines them for a full-time employee, if indeed they're different, and it lists the items that are included in the fringe benefit and the percentages, and here it even has one that is a blended rate. This says 4.5%, is a blended rate of 9% on the first $12,000 earned. These are just some examples of what the narrative section might look like. In this bottom portion here, it's got the what a fringe narrative may look like for the second method. It shows how the separate fringe benefit is calculated. Again, it lists the percentages and amounts used for each item within that fringe benefit. And then here there's a note that says rate is the same percentage from the personnel tab for staff's percentage of time in that grant. So these examples might be helpful in determining what you should include in that narrative section. Please be aware that we have separate videos available as guides to completing each of the individual cost tabs in the budget spreadsheet. Thanks for watching.